Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Idealist with Dr. Yvonne Tor. Yvonne for short. So glad you could join me today. Today I've been thinking about the idea of boundaries. I've been thinking about how do you set boundaries in a way that's aligned for you without wrestling with guilt and feeling like you're being bad for setting boundaries. How can you set boundaries without walling yourself off from the world, um, knowing that you'll piss some people off? So that's what I'm thinking about today, boundaries. When I think about boundaries, I like to think about the concept of living big, which is from Rising Strong by Brene Brown. So I would like to talk about that today. But first of all, what do we mean by boundaries? From the work from the Rising Strong, Dare to Lead, Daringway work, we define boundaries as what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And for me, that's been a very helpful definition of boundaries. I came up in a culture where boundaries, I think most immigrants and people from different ethnic backgrounds have very interesting views of what boundaries are. And I think for me, being of Nigerian descent and just the there are no boundaries. There are no boundaries. So I grew up without a sense of boundaries. I felt like everybody was entitled to my space, entitled to my body, and it was very, very powerful to learn the skill sets for setting boundaries in a way that's aligned and grounded. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. And so when I talk about boundaries, I always think about, what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. I really like that definition of boundaries. It's simple, it's accessible, and it makes it very easy to articulate your boundaries. So when you think about boundaries in your life, whether it's in your friendships or your relationships, I've been doing a lot of coaching recently, and it's interesting to see how many people get resentful and upset and angry with people in their lives who are not respecting their boundaries. Really upset at something someone said or something someone did, and then I'll ask them, did you tell them that was okay or not okay? Do they know that's a boundary for you? And they're like, no, I never said anything. I'm like, then how are they supposed to know? Right. So I really love the idea of boundaries being a way for us to tell people how to love us or how to treat us. Right. It's our way of setting those parameters for the things that we value. Right. Putting boundaries around the things that are important to us, whether it's our time or energy or our bodies or our well-being. Right. So when you think about boundaries, how good are you at setting boundaries? Like I said, I didn't really know what boundaries were. And then when I did learn about boundaries, I felt massively guilty for for feeling like I wanted boundaries, and then when I tried to set them, instead of having the hard conversations, what I struggled with was just setting up walls. I would just, I'll take it and take it and take it. I'll take the behavior and take the behavior and take the behavior. And after a while, my body, my mind is like, we can't take it anymore. And then I just wall off and cut off. And that was not a healthy way of dealing with boundaries. So learning about this work has been really powerful for me because it's helped me articulate what's important to me and protect what's important to me and show people how to love me without having to cut people off or create walls and wall myself in. So when I think about boundaries, I like to think about. I love this book by Townsend and Cloud. It's called Boundaries. If you have a moment, take a look at it. And I think Nidra Tawab also has a great book on boundaries as well. And of course, articulating boundaries in Rising Strong and Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. So lots of great books out there on boundaries. But when I think about boundaries, what I like to think about is the idea of like a fence around a house, like a fence around a yard, and there's a house. The house is you, and all of the things that matter to you are in that house, right? And then your boundaries are like the fence around the house, to say, okay, here's my territory. The fence marks the territory, and there's a gate in it. So the good things, the gate, right? It's not a wall where you're just completely walled off, but there's a gate there. And so the fence, and I like to think of a picket fence for some reason. But the fence keeps the good things in and the bad things out, and the gate lets the bad things out from your territory and the good things in. So bad things, quote unquote bad things, not really bad things, just things that are not helpful or supportive for you, right? No judgment here. So we think about good things like respectful friendships, hard conversations, connection and curiosity and adventure and service and all of the great things that we care about. We keep them in our yard, or we allow them in our values. And then the bad things such as disrespect, manipulation, gaslighting, things that are not okay, right? We can keep the fence keeps those bad things out, and the gate helps us release the things that maybe might have been good in one season but are no longer beneficial for us, or supportive of us. So I always think about the fence, that the boundaries, that way. When I'm talking to my clients, one of the metaphors or analogies I like to use is, not sharing your boundaries is kind of like, when when um when a neighbor, you look out your window and you see your neighbor is walking by your house, and and you're telling me the story of how the neighbor was walking the dog by your house, and then they let the dog poop in your yard, and you're looking out the window and you're like, what the heck, how dare this neighbor, allow the dog to poop in my yard. And then the neighbor walks away with the dog, hadn't picked up the poop or anything, just walked away. And then you're fuming and you're telling me the story, and I say, okay, like, is this neighbor, like, do you have a good relationship with the neighbor? And you're like, yeah, sure. And I said, okay, do you have a fence around your yard? Do they know where your yard starts and ends? Do they know where your territory starts and ends? And you're like, no, I don't have a fence. Then how is the neighbor supposed to know that that's your yard, and you're there angry and completely pissed off that the neighbor allowed the dog to poop in your yard? And so that's what I like to think about. And then if you're telling me the story and I say, okay, um did you have a fence around the yard? And you say yes. Then we know we're dealing with something completely different, where the neighbor comes in, opens the gate, and lets the dog in and allows the dog to poop in your yard. When that happens, you're dealing with a sociopathic situation. Then you have like a really weird relationship, really unhealthy, toxic relationship with your neighbor, right? So that's a great way of looking at boundaries. Like, do you have a fence around your yard? So the fence is like the boundaries. If you don't have a fence around your yard, how is your neighbor supposed to know where, to allow the dog to poop or not poop, right? And you're there taking it personally, and you're really angry and resentful and feeling like they're doing it on purpose, but really it's that you never articulated what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, right? So those are boundaries. I like to think about the concept of living big. So going to living big, right? BIG. B means boundaries, I means integrity with your values, and G means generosity. So we've already defined boundaries as what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And then we think about integrity as being aligned with your values, being in integrity, being whole, being completely authentic to the values that are important to you, right? Whether it's creativity or connection or service or respect, whatever. Those things that you treasure that are important to you. Think about like all your jewelry in your house or your kids in your house. Like the things that are important to you. Those are your values, or those are what's in the house, and that's what the boundaries protect, right? And then generosity, always coming from the assumption that people are doing the best they can and that you're doing the best you can. So the idea of living big really helps us to set aligned boundaries without shame or guilt, because living big is the idea of what boundaries do I need in place so that I can live in integrity with my values while coming from the assumptions that people are doing the best they can, right? Assuming, coming from the assumptions of and intentions of compassion and grace, right? So, boundaries, what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Integrity, right? Choosing alignment with your values, choosing courage over comfort, choosing right over what's easy, or fun or fast, and choosing to practice our values rather than professing them. And then G is generosity, working from assumptions and intentions of compassion and grace, that people are doing the best they can. So living big, the way we set boundaries, in an aligned way without shame or guilt, is living big, using the statement. What boundaries, that's the B, do I need to put in place so I can work from a place of integrity with my values while assuming or extending the most generous interpretations of the words, intentions, and actions of others or this person that you're setting a boundary with? So, thinking about this, right, you can think about how it's not easy, because you'll have to sit down and articulate what's okay, what's not okay, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, right? I've had friendships where, I'll give an example of a friendship where, um should I give this example? Okay, I will, right? I've had friendships. In my friendships, I usually will articulate like the boundaries, and I'll tell them what my values are, of, whether it's service or connection or authenticity, integrity. And I'll say, like in this friendship, I just really would like us to connect consistently, and so we'll have like a standing time where we're connecting. We don't have to see each other all the time, but I really like in my friendships to like keep in touch, once in a while. Um and and then I would have a friend who would only talk to me when they're not in a relationship. So whether they're gone off, when they're in a relationship, um they're gone. So when I call, they're not answering, and they are not returning my calls. And then suddenly, if they have a breakup, or if they're fighting with their boyfriend, suddenly now they're calling and they're, coming to be in touch with me, and, trying to connect. And so after noticing this pattern, after a while, is like, okay, this is not okay, right? So what boundaries do I need in place so I can live in integrity with my values while coming from the assumption that this person is doing the best they can? So they're doing the best they can. However, connection is important to me, and I want to be able to stay connected in some form. So the boundary I articulate is, it's not okay for you to disappear, whenever, and only resurface when you have a fight with your boyfriend or you're going through a hard time with your boyfriend. Like, it should be a friendship where, if I reach out, you can reach back out or reconnect. Like, you don't have to disappear for months on end and only surface when you're between boyfriends or having a fight with your boyfriend. I know it sounds petty, but this is a boundary for me, and having to express that, right? So, or maybe an example could be, you have a partner who doesn't help with anything in the house, and you're doing the laundry and feeding the kids, and cleaning the house, and putting the gas in the tank, and like you're cooking, and you're supposed to do all this stuff, and meanwhile your partner is just sitting on the couch. You can say, when I ask you, okay, what are your values, right? So to be able to set good boundaries, to be able to set the fence up, you have to know what your territory is. Have to know where your house is, and you have to know how large your yard is, right? So, which means that you have to be able to be clear about what values are important to you. And so, right, so I'll ask you, what values are important to you? And you say, okay, time with my family, respect, fairness, justice. Then I say, in light of fairness slash justice and connection with your family, assuming that your partner is doing the best that they can, while also wanting to be in integrity with your values of fairness and justice and connection, right? What's the boundary here? What's okay and what's not okay? What's acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? And so then you can say, well, it's okay for us to have time together as a family or do laundry together while I fold. We can fold the clothes together. It's not okay for me to have to do all the chores by myself, right? So that's a boundary like that. And so I will invite you to take a piece of paper and a pen and, really sit down and think about, what boundaries, think about a specific area of your life where you're really struggling with a boundary, right? And, you know, write out your values, like what's really important to you, what's in your house, what's in your yard, what's really important to you. And then come from the assumption that that person, the person you're trying to set boundaries with, is doing the best they can, and so are you, right? And so write down, like, in this situation, in light of my values, looking at the situation through the lens of my values, what boundaries do I need in place so I can live in integrity with my values while assuming this person is doing the best they can, right? So it's okay to blah 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 blah, it's not okay to blah 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 blah. And then the same thing goes for, sometimes we're not having to set boundaries with others. Sometimes it's a boundary that we have to set with ourselves. I'll give you an example. So one of the things that I used to do where I violated my boundaries all the time, and usually that you violated your boundaries when you're like angry, resentful, and that usually is an indication that a boundary has been violated or a value has been violated or a need or expectation has not been met. And so when you think about um, your relationship with yourself, sometimes you have to set boundaries with yourself if you find that you're constantly violating your own, you're constantly betraying yourself or violating your own boundaries. And of course, I'll use myself as an example. One of the things I used to do was form friendships with people who were emotionally unavailable. I don't know why this was my thing, but again, first of all, I already love very introverted people. But then there was another thing of people who were emotionally unavailable. Like, because then I would have to work hard to get something about having to work hard to get their friendship made me feel safe, because I was used to being, exploited and things like that, people coming for me. And so I've started to value, as a kid, I started to value people who were not invested, who were not looking to me for anything, who didn't care. Then I would form the friendship and work hard for it and then earn their friendship. Then it's like it felt safe because I knew they were not going to exploit me, which is crazy, I know. But that was how I was before all of this work. And so realizing how much pain I was having to go through because I was always going for people who were, I had to keep hustling. I had to keep hustling for their love and affection, attention. I sat down and I said, okay, what are my values? Again, service and connection and authenticity or integrity, creativity. So in light of this, and knowing that, again, assuming that these people are doing the best that they can, what values do I need in place? What boundaries do I need in place so I can live in integrity with my values of wanting to really connect and get to know someone, and curiosity, and service, and wanting to be of service and be myself, while assuming this person is doing the best they can. And so for me, the boundaries that came up were, I am no longer I'm no longer allowing myself to pursue friendships with emotionally unavailable people. So that was one boundary. Another boundary was I no longer, it was not no longer okay for me to hustle for love. If I'm in a situation where I'm having to work hard and like try to prove myself and try to say love me, then that's not a healthy place for me to be, based on my history, based on my traumas. So when I find myself doing that, that's not okay. I'm violating my own boundaries. It's not okay for me to um keep pursuing someone who has no interest in me. Because there's so many other people who love and care about me, and I could be focusing all of that energy on them instead of having to convert people, right? And so again, it sounds silly, whatever, that's my truth. Don't judge me. And so really wanting to be in friendships that were nurturing to me, that felt like reciprocal and mutual affection and attention and positive regard, right? And so that's an example. Now, there's some things that can get in the way of us setting boundaries, or living big, right? The idea of like setting boundaries. What boundaries do I need to have in place so I can live in integrity with my values, while coming from the assumption that people are doing the best they can? So things like perfectionism, right? Like we want things to be perfect. So we want to be able to say exactly the right thing, and we want to be able to protect ourselves and do things perfectly. Well, that gets in the way of us setting boundaries. We're like, okay, maybe when the kids get out of when kids graduate out of high school, then I'll finally like set a boundary with my partner. Like what? you know, sometimes it's a fear of grief, right? It's fear of losing the relationship, fear of having to deal with the sad feelings. Maybe you realize, oh well, if I'm setting a boundary with this person and they cut me off, then they didn't really care about this relationship anyway. And that fear of like, what happens if I set this this boundary, right? And then the sadness, like fear, sometimes sadness can keep us from setting those boundaries, because we need that person. And then just fear in general, we're afraid of pissing someone off, we're afraid of losing friendships, we're afraid of being judged as being bitchy or like mean. And then or fear of being alienated, right, or being kicked out of the family. And then self-judgment, right, judging yourself for having needs, right? For me, it's like judging myself, that wow, like why can't you just like, why do you constantly have to go after these people who are unavailable, and judging myself. And so like setting the boundaries, like it's like I'm judging myself for wanting to set the boundary. And that's not okay. Like self-judgment is not okay, right? I have needs. It's okay for me to want to have a certain kind of friendship. For some people it doesn't matter, but for me it does. That emotional availability the emotional availability, the openness, the love. I'm my friends describe me as very deep emotionally, and like sometimes it's really nice to be able to just jump in the deep end with someone, and they'll also like be able to be silly as well, right? So I have needs for being silly, and I have needs for being very deep, and those needs are all equally valid. And not judge myself for wanting things that nurture me and make me happy. So that's the concept of living big. um So, how about you? What boundaries? That's your homework. So, what boundaries do you need to put in place? Look at your relationships, your friendships. Or maybe it's your relationship with yourself. Maybe it's at work. Maybe someone's always calling you a name that you don't like. What boundary? Assuming that person's doing the best they can, what boundaries can you put in place while living in integrity with your values? Right? If kindness is an important value for you, you want to be able to set boundaries in a way that's kind, right? Or if connection is important to you, setting a boundary in a way that allows you to connect, or respect the value of connection. And so that's what I'm thinking about today. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. If you need help with anything in terms of going deep with these concepts, or maybe attending a Dare to Lead, or a Dare to Lead workshop, or attending any of my workshops. I think Dare to Lead is coming up March 2nd. But or one-on-one coaching, or you just want to you want me to riff on any topic, send me an email, shoot me send me an email or DM me on any of my social media, to cover any topic that you think might be important to cover. Here's to you thriving. Now go cultivate your light and remember that you matter, and I am rooting for you. And here's to all of us changing the world by doing what matters and thriving as we're doing it. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.